I used to believe that if something was wrong, I would feel it immediately. That intuition would warn me. That love came with some kind of internal alarm system. I was wrong, because sometimes, reality doesn't shatter. It cracks quietly, slowly, invisibly. This is not a story about betrayal discovered in a dramatic moment. No sudden confession, no screaming arguments. This is the story of how I slowly uncovered my partner's secret life. A life that existed parallel to mine. A life I never suspected. And once I saw it clearly, I couldn't unsee it. Part 1. The life I thought I knew. Part 1.1. A relationship that looked normal. English. From the outside, our relationship looked normal. Comfortable. Predictable. Safe. We had routines. Morning coffee. Evening check-ins. Weekend plans that repeated themselves. There was nothing suspicious. Nothing dramatic. And that's what made everything harder to see. Because secrets don't always hide in chaos. Sometimes, they hide inside stability. Part 1.2. The first small feeling. The first sign wasn't a discovery. It was a feeling. A quiet discomfort. I couldn't name. Nothing concrete. Just moments that didn't fully add up. Delayed replies. Slight changes in tone. New privacy where there hadn't been any before. I told myself, I was overthinking. That long-term relationships naturally evolve. And for a while, that explanation worked. Part 1.3. The normalization of doubt. Doubt doesn't arrive as suspicion. It arrives as normalization. You adjust, you accept, you lower your expectations without realizing it. I stopped asking certain questions. Not because I didn't care, but because I didn't want the answers. Silence became easier than curiosity. And that's where secrets thrive. Part 1.4. The person I thought I loved. I loved the version of them I saw every day. The familiar one. The predictable one. I didn't realize I was loving only part of the truth. Because while I was building a life with them, they were building another one somewhere else. Quietly, carefully, and completely outside my awareness. Part 1.5. The calm before knowing. The scariest part is this. Before you discover the truth, life often feels calm. Because ignorance feels like peace. And once that peace is gone, you realize how fragile it always was. I didn't know it yet, but my life was already changing. Part 2. The first real discovery. Part 2.1. The moment something felt off. The first real discovery didn't feel dramatic. There was no shock, no moment where everything suddenly made sense. It felt unsettling, like realizing a room you've lived in for years has an extra door you've never noticed before. I didn't even know what I was looking for at first. I just knew something wasn't lining up anymore. Small inconsistencies started to stack up. And once you start noticing them, it becomes impossible to ignore. Part 2.2. The small detail I almost missed. It started with something insignificant. A notification that disappeared too quickly. A change in routine that didn't have a clear explanation. I noticed it, then immediately dismissed it. Because trust teaches you to look away. Trust trains you to explain things for the other person. But that detail stayed with me. It followed me through the day, quietly reminding me that something was off. Part 2.3. Curiosity turns into awareness. I didn't confront them, not yet. Instead, I became more observant. I listened more carefully. I paid attention to what wasn't being said, and slowly, a pattern began to form. Late nights explained too casually. Phone calls taken in other rooms. New emotional distance disguised as stress. Each sign on its own meant nothing. Together, they told a different story. Part 2.4. The search I didn't want to start. There's a moment when curiosity becomes a decision. A point of no return. I remember hesitating. Because searching means accepting the possibility that you won't like what you find. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself I was invading privacy. And yet, my hand moved before my mind could stop it. That's when everything began to shift. Part 2.5. The first concrete evidence. What I found wasn't explosive. It wasn't proof of betrayal. At least not directly. It was something subtler. A second version of their life. Different conversations. Different tone. Different priorities. I realized I wasn't discovering a single secret. I was discovering a system of secrecy. Carefully maintained. Carefully separated from me. That realization hit harder than any confession could. Part 2.6. The emotional whiplash. I didn't cry right away. I didn't feel anger. I felt disoriented, like my reality had quietly tilted. I started questioning my own memories, moments, I once thought were genuine, now felt incomplete. I wasn't sure what was real anymore, and that uncertainty was more terrifying than the truth itself. Part 2.7. Knowing without being ready. I knew something significant was happening, but I wasn't ready to face it. Knowing and accepting are not the same thing. I carried that knowledge quietly. I watched them, the same way someone watches a stranger, trying to reconcile who I thought they were with what I was beginning to see. And that tension marked the beginning of the end. Part 3. Connecting the hidden pieces. Part 3.1. When patterns begin to appear. Once you notice one secret, you start noticing others. Not because they suddenly appear, but because you've finally stopped looking away. I began replaying recent weeks in my head. Conversations that felt rushed, excuses that sounded rehearsed, emotional reactions that didn't match the situation. Individually, they were nothing. Together, they formed a pattern. And patterns are hard to unsee. Part 3.2. Two versions of the same person. I started noticing how different they sounded depending on who they were talking to. With me, they were calm, familiar, predictable. With others, they were energized, animated, almost like a different version of themselves. I realized something unsettling. I didn't know which version was real, or if either of them truly was. Part 3.3. The gaps in their story. I began noticing gaps, time unaccounted for, details that changed slightly each time they were told, stories that didn't contradict each other, but didn't fully align either. That's how good lies work. They aren't dramatic, they're subtle, designed to blend into everyday life. I realized this wasn't about one secret. It was about maintaining a parallel reality. Part 3.4. The emotional distance makes sense. Suddenly, their emotional distance made sense. You can't fully show up in two lives at once. Something always gets neglected, and in our relationship, that something was me. I stopped feeling confused. I started feeling replaced, like I was sharing space with someone who had already emotionally moved elsewhere. Part 3.5. Discovering the scope of the secret life. What scared me most wasn't what I found. It was how organized it all was. Separate accounts, separate conversations, separate emotional investments. This wasn't an accident, this was intention, and that realization changed everything. Because mistakes can be forgiven, but constructed lives are harder to accept. Part 3.6. Watching them without being seen. I began observing them, the way you observe a stranger. Quietly, carefully, I noticed habits I'd ignored before. Micro-expressions, hesitations, emotional shifts I couldn't unsee anymore. I realized something heartbreaking. I had been living with someone I didn't fully know. Part 3.7. The moment the puzzle clicked. Then came the moment where everything clicked, not in a dramatic way, but with quiet certainty. I wasn't uncovering isolated secrets. I was uncovering a double life. A version of them I was never meant to know. And that knowledge settled heavily inside me. Because, once you see a double life clearly, there's no pretending everything is fine anymore. Part 4. The double life revealed. Part 4.1. The moment I stopped doubting myself. There comes a moment when doubt gives way to certainty. Not relief, not clarity, just certainty. And certainty is heavier than doubt. Because doubt still leaves room for hope. Certainty does not. That was the moment I stopped questioning my instincts and started accepting what was in front of me. Part 4.2. Seeing the full shape of the secret life. Once the picture became clear, it was impossible to shrink it back down. I could see how much time it required, how much emotional energy it consumed. This wasn't something done on the side. It was a second life. Carefully scheduled, carefully protected, and entirely separate from me. I realized I hadn't been sharing my partner. I had been excluded. Part 4.3. Rewriting every memory. Every memory began to shift. Trips we took, late nights I waited up, times I felt lonely without knowing why. They all took on new meaning. I realized I wasn't imagining the distance. I had been sensing it accurately all along. And that realization was devastating. Because it meant I had been right and still ignored myself. Part 4.4. The emotional betrayal. What hurt most wasn't the secrecy. It was the emotional investment elsewhere. The laughter I wasn't part of. The conversations I never heard. The version of them that felt alive without me. That was the betrayal. Not physical, but emotional displacement. And emotional betrayal cuts deeper because it's invisible. Part 4.5. Watching them pretend everything was normal. What made it worse was how normal everything looked. They still smiled, still joked, still asked about my day. And now, I understood why it felt hollow. Because, half of them wasn't there anymore. I was talking to a version of them, designed for me. And that knowledge created a distance I couldn't close. Part 4.6 The loneliness of knowing alone. Knowing the truth didn't bring relief. It brought isolation. Because, I couldn't unsee what I knew. But, I also couldn't confront them yet. I carried the truth silently. And that silence felt heavier than ignorance ever did. I realized something terrifying. I was grieving the relationship while still living inside it. Part 4.7 Accepting that nothing would be the same. At some point, I stopped asking whether I could go back to before. Because, I already knew the answer. Once a secret life is revealed, the relationship is permanently altered. You may stay, you may try, but you will never unknow what you know. And that knowledge reshapes everything. Part 5 Confrontation and the quiet aftermath. Part 5.1 The decision to confront. There comes a moment when knowing becomes unbearable. Not because of anger, but because of exhaustion. Carrying the truth alone began to drain me. Every interaction felt fake. Every smile felt like a performance. I realized silence was no longer protecting me. It was slowly erasing me instead. That's when I decided I couldn't keep pretending. Something had to be said. Part 5.2 The confrontation itself. I didn't confront them in anger. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply asked questions I already knew the answers to. At first, they denied everything. Not aggressively, gently, almost convincingly. I watched their expressions carefully. The hesitation, the pauses, the way their story adjusted in real time. That's when I knew this wasn't new for them. This was a practiced reality. Part 5.3 Hearing the truth out loud. Eventually, the truth surfaced. Not all at once. In fragments, carefully revealed, as if limiting damage was still possible. Hearing it out loud was different. It made everything real, irreversible. I felt my body react before my mind did. Tight chest, shallow breathing, a strange calm settling in. That calm scared me, more than panic ever could. Part 5.4 Realizing what was lost. I realized I wasn't just losing a relationship. I was losing a future I had planned around them. The version of my life that assumed their presence. Every dream had to be reimagined. And that grief arrived quietly. Not as tears, but as disorientation. Like standing in a familiar place that suddenly no longer feels safe. Part 5.5 The quiet aftermath. After the confrontation, nothing exploded. There were no dramatic exits. No slammed doors. Just a heavy quiet that settled between us. We spoke less, moved carefully around each other. As if we were already strangers, sharing the same space. I realized something heartbreaking. The relationship didn't end in one moment. It ended slowly, quietly, long before anyone officially said goodbye. Part 5.6 Understanding the deeper truth. What hurt most wasn't the secret life itself. It was realizing how long I had been alone. Even while in a relationship. Love without presence slowly becomes absence. And absence leaves room for other lives to grow. That understanding changed how I saw everything. Including myself. Part 5.7 Letting go without closure. There was no clean ending. No perfect closure. Just acceptance. Accepting that some truths don't come to fix things. They come to reveal what can no longer survive. Letting go wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, painful, and necessary. Part 5.8 Message to the listener. If you're listening to this, and something feels familiar, trust that feeling. Pay attention to quiet discomfort. Ask questions before silence becomes permanent. Because discovering the truth late doesn't just change your relationship. It changes how you see yourself. This has been spoken by Reddit. Real stories, calmly told. If this story stayed with you, if it made you pause, reflect, or feel a little less alone, consider subscribing to Spoken by Reddit. We share long, honest stories, calmly told, for those quiet moments. When listening feels easier than speaking. New stories are added regularly. Thank you for being here, and for listening all the way to the end. This has been Spoken by Reddit. Real stories, calmly told. If this story stayed with you, if it made you pause, reflect, or feel a little less alone, consider subscribing to Spoken by Reddit. We share long, honest stories, calmly told, for those quiet moments. When listening feels easier than speaking. New stories are added regularly. Thank you for being here, and for listening all the way to the end.